So thank you so much for coming along. And before we get going, I thought I'd just cover a little bit about who we are. So if you're new to the Tree Council, we're a national charity and we bring everyone together for the love of trees. And we do this in a few different ways. So we fund, plant, and care for trees and hedgerows with our tree wardens and community groups all across the country through our community grant scheme. So if you've got any tree wardens out there today, hello, and thank you so much for everything that you do. We have a schools program and we like to inspire the next generation of environmentalists through our national schools program. So hello to all of our young tree champions and any teachers out there. And we use practical science and research to influence national policy and support best practice on trees, and in this case, hedgerows and hedgerow trees, and the environment in the whole. And we work with an incredible number of partner organisations to kind of harness the power of partnership and in order to be able to create a healthy tree-filled future. So if you've not heard of the Tree Council before, if this is your first dealing with the Tree Council, please do check out our website and yeah, you can learn more about what we do. So this whole week, National Hedgerow Week, and our hedgerow project is called Life on the Hedge, and this is a national hedgerow program. It's all about raising awareness of how brilliant our hedgerows are, all that they do for us, and the aim is to try and empower people to create more hedgerows, create better connected hedgerows, manage them better, and create a kind of a hedge-filled future for the country. So to do this, we're funded by the Trees Call Action Fund, Trees Call to Action Fund. This is a national fund, and it was developed by DEFRA and the Forestry Commission, and it's delivered to us through the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So thank you to all our funders that help us do this amazing campaign and put on these hedge talks. We couldn't do it without them. So today we're going to dive straight into the world of hedgerow trees and look at kind of what they are, why they're so important, where they've come from, and where they're going. But before we do that, before we look at hedgerow trees, it is important that we make sense of what a hedgerow is. You can't have a hedgerow tree without a hedgerow. And so, John, what is a hedgerow? And is a hedge and a hedgerow the same thing?
So we start with the difficult bits, Will. We start with the definitions of things, and that's always the most complicated. Hedges and hedgerows are words that are usually synonymous. So they're interchangeable. You can talk about hedges or hedgerows. Some people think that one has hedgerow trees in it and the other doesn't, but I'm not sure whether there's any history to that really. And I think the two words have just become utterly interchangeable. So for the purposes of today, for hedge read hedgerow, for hedgerow read hedge. They're all pretty similar. But there are some technical definitions of what a hedgerow is. And I think the technical definition is that a hedgerow is a row of trees or shrubs with no more than 5 meters between the bases of the trees, forming the boundary between two bits of land for whatever reason, which is a technical definition, not necessarily all that helpful for most people in their everyday lives. And I see hedges as a sort of mixed habitat. There are all sorts of different elements that are working together. So we have a ditch and a bank that's often there that separates the hedge from the fields. We often have a flower-rich margin along the bottom. We have a shrubby layer, which, as you can see in this one, is a mixture of hazel and blackthorn and all sorts, elm mixed in there into the shrub layer. And then above it, we have the trees, the hedgerow trees sitting above as that third vertical dimension to the hedge that takes it above the shrub layer at the bottom. And it's that makes a hedge important. It's the multiple layers. And so that's, I think, what we're going to use for today's discussion.
That's right. And it's those different aspects of a hedgerow which are so important. But they don't always have to have all of these different aspects. So, for instance, this hedgerow has hedgerow trees. There might be hedgerows without hedgerow trees. There might be a hedgerow without a ditch. And in different parts of the country, you might have different characteristics. So you go down to Devon, there's a lot of the hedges, what they call them hedges down in Devon, have hedge banks, but not necessarily. You might not necessarily get hedge banks in other parts of the country. But it's not just in rural areas in the countryside that we get hedges. They're all over the country. And and they're really important. So we've looked at what a hedgerow is, and but we need to think about why they're so important to have within a landscape. So the graph on the right here suggests that hedgerows really are quite important. So what we've got here is a graph which shows the treescape of the UK. Now, the treescape is just a bit of a techie term for saying all the different trees, the tree cover across the country. And here it's been divided up into kind of different classifications. We've got commercial conifer forest, so imagine trees planted for timber. We've got hedgerows here, which is circled. We've got ancient woodland. We've got native broadleaf. We've got small woods. I think it's all been divided up, and we can see that hedges and other linear features are actually the second largest habitat or feature of the treescape after commercial conifer forest. They create a huge amount of the tree cover and trees within our country. So John, I'll pop this infographic in. It's hedgerows fill a huge number of roles, don't they, within the landscape? Could
They
you
do.
could you run us through some of the key features of what hedgerows do for us?
They do, Will. And the graph on the right we developed in the production of the tree strategy toolkit for local authorities, and it was the first time that we'd actually worked out just what a vast area of the countryside is occupied by hedges. And the thing is that you see a hedge in a very small strip. You see a little bit of hedge in your community or in your landscape, and therefore you don't always think about when you put it all together what a vast area they occupy. And what that area does, as you can see in the picture, is it provides a whole range of different opportunities, and it does a whole range of different things. So as you can see there, hedges are good for wood fuel, they're good for wildlife, they're good for pollinators, they can provide crop protection to the fields behind them, they can provide forage and food for both humans and wildlife, as we can see from the couple picking things off the hedge at the back. And so in all of those opportunities, the value of the hedge comes from the fact that it spreads across the country in this vast area, but it's a vast, relatively small area, and that's what makes hedges so particularly good. It's a small habitat, covers a large area, and has a huge impact.
Brilliant. But they look different all across the country, aren't they? So we've got some different examples of what hedgerow might look like. So this might be a scene which is more which is commonly seen to some people. Is this a hedgerow? What we're looking at here?
It's definitely a hedgerow. It's possibly two hedgerows. You can start to see that we've got a bank on either side of this old track. We're seeing different sides of the hedge. So we're seeing the sunny south-facing one on the left. We're seeing the darker, shady north-facing one on the right. And the flowers are richer on the sunny side of the hedge, but there are a few on the north side of the right-hand hedge. We've got a clipped box, but there's no ditch on either side. There are flower margins. There's no hedgerow tree. So we've got two of the four components we talked about earlier in the hedge: a linear line of vegetation, woody vegetation, some flower margins, but not a ditch and no hedgerow trees. But it is still a hedgerow.
Okay, and this looks predominantly hawthorn in the shrubbery component, and it's in a rural setting. But it's not just in rural settings, hedgerows.
No,
and they don't necessarily always have native species.
that's right.
So this might be more what people see in urban areas or next to houses and housing developments. Is this as much a hedge as the previous image?
Definitely, because this is still forming many of the functions that a hedge does. It provides that shelter. It provides the wind barrier. It provides the opportunity for species to breed in it. This is a single species hedge of probably laurels. So it's never going to be as biodiverse as a multi-species hedge full of native species, but it is still going to provide really important habitat for a range of creatures to live in there, to thrive in there. And hedgehogs would easily feed amongst the bottom of this. So yes, this is an urban hedge. It's a slightly different structured hedge, but it is still an important hedge to the landscape.
I think what we should say about this hedgerow as well is that although laurel hedges are sometimes yeah, vilified a little bit. Next to a playground like this, one of the great things that hedgerows do is that they can act as a barrier between pollution. So I'm assuming there's going to be a road on the other side of that, and what hedges can do is that they can deflect polluted air and deflect it, and it mixes it with cleaner air above and deflects it away from people. In this instance, children playing in the playground. Um, and evergreen species like laurel are especially good at this because they can do that all year round. Whereas if a hedgerow loses its leaves during the winter, you might have a bit of a lesser effect during the winter. So in
Yeah.
urban areas, they're super important as well. It's not just in the countryside. Um, Now this might be something which people see a lot in the countryside, and this looked a little bit different to what we've looked at. Um, what we're looking at here is this a hedgerow?
It's definitely a hedgerow. It's a hedgerow that's had a particular type of management for a long period of time. It's been basically cut at the same point. And you can see halfway up, there's a sort of thick layer where the top of the hedge is, and then there's the thin wispy growth growing out the top. And that's a hedge that's been cut at the same point for a long time, but it's also been grazed out at the bottom by the sheep. The branches don't grow as well under the bottom of the, and you get these little mushrooms, which is effectively what we're looking at here. It's definitely still a hedge. It's definitely providing some of the biodiversity value, some of the ecological value of other sorts of hedges, but it's getting less because of the way it's being managed, because of the way it's being looked after.
We know, don't we, that hedgerows that are kind of denser and fuller and bushier and provide more kind of niches for wildlife to live in are better for wildlife. So as we get an overmanaged hedgerow like this, we see decreases in that density. We see these gaps. If you were a dormouse trying to move along it, it might be more difficult. You might feel a bit more exposed to predators, that kind of thing. So the way we manage our hedgerows can have a huge impact onto like the function within a landscape. So that's an overmanaged hedge.
But before we move on, Will, just one of those curious things that people don't always think about. That management is effectively bonsaiing those trees. Those trees therefore have grown small and clipped for a very long time. And we are now discovering, literally only in the last few years, that some of these hawthorns in these old hedges that are clipped into these shapes can be really, really old. And we've now got ring counts for hawthorns that are probably no bigger than that one on the right there, maybe the size of a baked bean can, that the stems are nearly 200 years old because they have been cut and clipped over centuries to form this. So although it's not as great ecologically, some of those trees might be really, really old objects.
Okay. So we've got an overmanaged hedgerow here. And what about these ones here? Now this is kind of going down the other end of the spectrum. These look to me like they haven't been managed for a while.
So this is definitely a hedgerow that's starting to grow out. You can see on the left where it's hawthorn. You can see on the right it's a hazel hedge. They've either been planted very deliberately as an avenue, or they are a hedge that has grown out over the last couple of 100 years. It's probably impossible to be absolutely sure of which is which, unless you can find any horizontal layers between the trees. They call them pleachers, which is where historically somebody had cut the hedge and laid it and pinned it. And then you can start to be absolutely sure. But these definitely look like old hedges. They definitely look like old hedges that have grown out, and they are still serving many of those functions of a hedge, except that the animals can get through at the base.
Mm-hmm. But we can see here, can't we, that there are ditches and banks,
Yes,
which and all these different aspects of a hedgerow create different ecological niches and places where things can live. And yes,
definitely.
but they're all hedges.
They're all hedges.
So we've covered what a hedge is, and you can't have a hedgerow tree without a hedge. But can you tell us what a hedgerow tree is? So when we talk about hedgerow trees, what are we talking about?
Well, again, there are some technical definitions of what a hedgerow tree is. And the technical definition is that it's a freestanding tree with a non-touching canopy where the tree has developed into its natural form, usually twice as high as the shrubby layer in the base. But that's just so that people can start to categorize and assess the population of our hedgerow trees, so that we start to get an assessment of what they look like. What we're looking at here is a beautiful line of young oak trees that have been put into this hedge probably 30, 40 years ago, which have formed a really nice corridor of hedges all the way along this boundary. This was up in Cleveland, actually. And it's a cracking example of a newly planted, well, relatively newly planted hedgerow tree line, where the trees are doing exactly what it says on the tin. They've become trees in hedges, hedgerow trees.
Brilliant. And it's also a nice example, isn't it? Because we have got, I think, every aspect here.
Yes, you have.
We've got a margin, uncut margin with tusky grasses and
Yep.
wildflowers. We've got a ditch going underneath it, and then the hedgerow sits on a hedge bank. We've got the shrub layer, and then we've got the hedgerow trees. So it's kind of ticks all the right boxes there, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay, so that's we might see those.
That's a
This is
classic hedgerow tree. It's where it gets a bit difficult, is when we start to get into other sorts of things. And I think our next picture is something a bit more urban.
That's right. This is in a park in Liverpool. We've got a sycamore and a cherry tree. Um, Hedgerow trees, though, they're not just a countryside thing. They are in our towns and cities, aren't they?
They definitely, and they're really important in both places. Whether, I mean, as the little girl's looking up at, that's a really splendid hedgerow tree in that hedge, providing that, again, that third dimension that stretches out, provides opportunities for biodiversity, wildlife, insects, birds above the hedge. And species of hedgerow tree really doesn't matter. I know we're going to go into this in a bit greater detail later, but a whole range of opportunities exist for different species of tree to occur in hedges, some of which are relatively uncommon. And that's important because our hedgerow tree population then becomes not just the trees themselves, but a really important reservoir of unusual and uncommon trees across the countryside.
That's right. And they perform like a really important service, don't they? Didn't you did you liken them to service stations for wildlife?
Yes. So yeah, that third dimension, that fact that the trees are stretching out in above the trees. When we were looking at this, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, we tried to articulate their importance to the landscape. And as you can see in this one, these trees are there joining the landscape together. They have become the service stations of the hedgerow network. If we think of the network of hedges as a sort of motorway, then these trees are the service stations. And the insects can fly between them. They can refuel at each one. They can stay in one for a bit if they want to. They can move on through the landscape. They become the stepping stones that help creatures to get across the landscape. And these, you've asked the question there, are these hedgerow trees? These are definitely hedgerow trees. The problem is that these hedgerow trees are ash. Do you want to do a little bit about ash dieback, Will? Should we talk about ash dieback?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's important that we're doing a little bit about ash. We can talk about a bit more about ash later on as well. But this week is Plant Health Week, and ash is one of our two most common species in our hedgerows. And you can see here, this ash is most likely suffering from something called ash dieback, which is a fungal disease. And it's impacting a huge number of our ash trees. And it shows that it's important to make sure that we have a good variety of trees within our hedgerows. If we only have a certain number of species, for instance, a large proportion of our hedgerow trees are ash, then it opens it up to things like ash dieback coming in and impacting a huge number a huge proportion of our hedgerow trees. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But yeah, ash trees, big component of our hedgerow tree population, and this is one here. What about this though? This is a bit of a bit more of an unusual one, John.
Well, Will threw this one at me in preparation for this and said, "This is the hedge," and he knows what it is, and I didn't. And it's a really difficult one because what we're seeing here is something that serves the function of a hedge, in that it's got a linear edge, and we haven't got the flower layer in this particular one. But looking through it, I started to see light through it. So I said to Will, "Is this what they call in southern England a shaw?" Now, a southern England shaw is a thin strip of either big hedge or small woodland that runs along the edges of fields. It's a very particular thing, and it's a very particular name that they use. And that's shaw spelled SHAW. And a shaw is basically a thick woodland edge strip. I said to Will, "Is that a shaw?" And he said, "No, it's a woodland." And so what we've got here is a woodland edge that's taking on many of the characteristics of a hedgerow. It's got a shrub layer. In this case, it's almost all holly. We've got the hedgerow tree sticking out over the top. We don't have much of a flower layer, and we don't have much of a ditch on this one. But what a hedgerow is doing is it's providing an edge, and it's the edge that's really important to the biodiversity. So even though this is a woodland edge, it is functioning like a hedgerow. But what a hedgerow does is it has the other side. It has another side. So the hedge has two edges, basically, the two vertical sides. And that's why they're really important for biodiversity, because the wildlife likes the habitat that is the edge of a woodland. And two edges on a hedgerow gives even better opportunities.
And I guess that's why it's important to distinguish between whether or not these are woodland trees or hedgerow trees, because it's that edge habitat with increased light levels. We see increased berry production and nut and seed production on the edges of woodland, and that in turn it provides sources of food for insects and pollinators. Um, in a relatively small space, it's a long, thin bit of woodland edge.
Yes.
And what's about this one? So this is kind of very topical today. This is kind of what we're going to talk about next. This is a very young tree within a hedgerow. Is it a hedgerow tree?
Definitely. But it's one of those that could become a major hedgerow tree. We're going to talk about age classes in a bit, but what matters here is that this is a young tree starting to get established, but it could be stopped from becoming a proper hedgerow tree by being flailed off, by dying of ash dieback because it's an ash. So it has the potential to become a full hedgerow tree, but it's a young hedgerow tree in the making, basically.
Brilliant. Okay. So what's good about hedgerow trees? Now, I think we'll focus on wildlife for the next couple of slides. So why are they so good for wildlife? Is there any particular wildlife they're good for? And why do they have advantages over something like a woodland tree or a park tree?
Well, as we said earlier, it's that service station element that has the opportunity. You can see this is one tree and there's not very many others in the landscape behind. So the wildlife can move into that tree, can occupy that tree, can use that tree as a jumping point to the next part of the landscape. And the biodiversity that's associated with the tree is dependent upon the species. So in this case, it's a little oak tree. It could have, anything up to it's not possible for one tree to support all of them, but oak trees can support 2,000 species. In this case, you might have hundreds of species living in that one tree, which is really important for the other wildlife. But hedges actually, interestingly, provide really important habitats for rare trees and uncommon trees in the landscape. I think our next one, Will, is an example of that.
That's right. Yeah, we've got some yew trees here, and Megan from People's Trust for Endangered Species recently made a very good point about hedgerow trees in that they are really important for the genetic variability of our trees within our landscapes. Because they are open grown, they provide they have absolutely loads of flowers and therefore lots of seeds. So they're really important for natural regeneration. They're really important for seed making its way across the landscape and being able to set along these highways. So we've got some yew trees here, haven't we, John?
We do. And yew trees are very, they're very specific in what they like. They like to grow in beech woodlands. They like to grow on the chalk. You often find them in churchyards and planted in urban areas, but you do find them in hedges. And here we've got a classic example of where the hedge is the habitat for this uncommon tree across the landscape. Where it gets even more specific is in our next slide, where we start to see some of our rarer trees in the countryside. The one on the left is a Devon whitebeam. And Devon whitebeam is almost entirely restricted to living in West Country hedges. There is nowhere else where you'll find it. And the one on the right is the Plymouth pear. And Plymouth pear is now restricted almost entirely to a group of hedgerows around Truro. And it's these rare minor species that have huge importance because they are a really critical part of the biodiversity of our hedgerows and our hedgerow tree population. And they are specific and unique in some places to our hedges.
Okay. And the another common sight in or a common sight in some of our hedgerows, as well as these kind of lesser known species, is very big old trees, isn't it? We have a lot of our hedgerow trees are very old. Um, and when we talk about ancient or veteran trees, these are big old trees, and they're characterized by these big areas of deadwood, big cavities. Um, what's so good about ancient trees, and why are hedgerow trees important for ancient trees?
So ancient trees are really, really vital to our landscape and to the biodiversity in it. And what you have here, people are going to say, I can't see a hedgerow on this one. Well, we'll come back to that in just a second. But hedges were often the engines for the production of ancient trees. And one of the phrases that people often want to know the origins of are ancient trees versus veteran trees. So an ancient tree is really a really old one. If we take an oak tree can make about 1,000 years old. If you compare that to a human, we can make 100. So one of your years is worth 10 of its. So in tree terms, an ancient tree is really somebody in the last 20%, from 80 to 100, from 800 to 1,000 in human and tree terms. And you can understand why that's an ancient tree, because it's really old. A veteran tree is a tree that might be younger, but has got characteristics of that old tree. So it's got holes and cracks and hollows. And it's those holes and cracks and hollows that might appear at 300 or 400 that wouldn't technically make it an ancient because it's 30, 40-year-old, but it's got holes and cracks and hollows in human terms. And it's that provides the opportunities for the biodiversity. And the way these were created were often that they grew in hedgerows. And as the tenant of the land, you had the right to chop the top of the tree off. So you chop the top of the tree off. And here we have a classic example in the middle there of an old pollard tree where they chopped the top off because as the tenant farmer, I had the rights to the arisings, to the material from the top. But the wood at the bottom belonged to the landlord. So I left that alone. What we then have here is 3 trees in a line. And you can start to see where there was an old hedgerow that ran across this landscape. This is an old landscape in Suffolk. It's a National Trust property where the landscape was designed. And what the early landscape designers did was they wanted to make an instant ancient landscape. So they took the old hedgerow trees and they basically rubbed out the hedges to give them an instant ancient landscape, which are often now our parklands. And the one on the right is down in Cornwall, which is an old tree where the hedge is long gone from the landscape, but probably arose in an old hedge line. And what we then have is these fantastic biodiversity opportunities standing either singly or in groups, in linear groups in hedges, old hedges. And that creates these really vital ancient trees.
And from as well as obviously creating this amazing kind of landscape character and being impressive and making our landscapes look amazing, it's the level of deadwood and cavities and cracks and little niches that's so important, isn't it, for some of our rarer wildlife. So they're very important for things like barbed-tailed bats. Can you tell us a bit more about barbed-tailed bats?
The barbed-tailed bats are one of our rarest bats. They love it in old hedgerows, or they love living in old trees, ancient trees, and they use hedgerows as ways to move through the landscape. And as you can see, that's a little barbastelle there. Absolutely distinctive facial features when you see them, with those really, really striking ears. And they use hedge lines to fly through the countryside. So you can see the red line here. This is from work that's done in Sussex. It's shown where the barbastelles have travelled down the hedge. Then they've turned right. As I'm looking at it on the screen, they've turned right. They've flown down. They've turned again. And then there wasn't a hedgerow in front of them. So they've worked out the next best option. And they've then jumped between those 2 hedgerow trees that are now left out on the fields on their own, the ancient trees that have been left. And then the bat turned back and went back into the rest of the habitat because it didn't like living out in the open. And that's the problem. As hedges changes, that we change the way they're managed, the biodiversity value starts to change with them. And I think in our next slide, we've got something about tree sparrows, haven't we? Well, do you want to do this one or shall I do that one?
I could do this one. So tree sparrows are another one of um, our kind of rarer species of sparrow. I think we've lost. I think it's about ninety
Over
percent,
90%.
over
Yeah.
90% in the last 50 or so years. And they love living in cracks, holes, cavities, which are often found in either our big old hedgerow trees or ancient trees. And without these, tree sparrows don't have places to nest. So we then end up having to put up artificial holes, like you can see on the right here, for tree sparrows to live in. So if we think about our hedgerow tree population, if it decreases, then we're going to see even further decreases in some of our kind of more rare species. Um, so there's some biodiversity benefits, but it's not just wildlife that hedgerow trees are hugely important for. So when we're talking about the benefits of trees within the landscape, you'll often hear the term ecosystem services, and that's just a bit of a techie term, which just means the benefits, the environmental benefits of something. Now, I thought this is a really good picture because it demonstrates a floodplain in North Wales, and we can see that hedgerow trees and hedgerows dominate that landscape. If we're looking at it, we just see these little blobs all over, and we can see the floodplain doing what it should do, which is flooding. But all these trees create a big surface area, create a big canopy, which intercept rainfall and can help reduce flooding. We've got urban areas here that we can see in here, and hedgerow trees and hedgerow networks, dense hedgerow networks of big hedgerow trees, are known to reduce the impact of flooding on urban areas. They not only that, they reduce nitrates leaching into our rivers. They provide shelter and shade for livestock, for increasing their well-being. You can things like willow within our hedgerow tree networks. They are livestock nibble the bark. Um, there's a compound in willow bark called salicylic acid, which is a kind of a natural pain relief. Pain relief. So you'll see farm animals nibbling the bark, and these are all things that improve the health and well-being of livestock. So there's absolutely loads of reasons why we need hedgerow trees and hedgerows within our landscapes. They store absolutely loads of carbon, and when you look at a landscape like this, you realise that if we have a problem with our hedgerow trees and we start losing them, our landscapes are going to look completely different. Um,
And that landscape in that picture is utterly dominated by those hedgerow trees. It's such a good picture to describe the importance. And the thing that matters here is that every single one of these trees matters, because we talk about vast numbers of trees being planted, but here, look, there's probably no more than, I don't know, I wish I'd counted them, but there's probably maybe 1,000 hedgerow trees. But look at the difference that 1,000 trees makes by comparison with putting those 1,000 trees in a woodland where they would occupy a much smaller area and have a much lesser impact on the landscape and on the biodiversity. And that's why they matter, because every single one of them counts.
okay, so before we talk about what's happening with our hedgerow trees today, and I'm conscious of the time, but could you give us a quick whistle-stop tour of a bit of hedgerow tree history?
So hedgerow tree history parallels that of the history of the hedges. Hedges have been in our landscape in various forms right back to nearly 5,000 years ago. There are no trees in our landscape in hedges that I know of that are 5,000 years, but the hedges themselves are, and the species in that hedgerow have changed over time. We've got, as we've talked about previously, we've got oaks and ashes, and we've got all sorts of other species, yews and other rarities. But the species have changed over time. We've got things like wild pear that have largely disappeared from our landscape. Elms, which used to be common in the landscape, have disappeared. Ash is starting to decline. So the whole nature of our hedgerow tree population is changing. And this is what you studied in your research, wasn't it, Will, in Shropshire? So let's move to
That's right.
Shropshire and have a look at some of that.
So yeah, what we're focusing on now, what we want to get to know is what the current state of our hedgerow trees is. So we can see that we use something called the Countryside Survey, which runs roughly about every 10 years or so, and that's kind of a litmus test which talks about which shows us the kind of national picture of our hedgerows and hedgerow trees. And it's a bit complex, this diagram, but what we can But what we can see within our national surveys, the countryside survey, is that since the 80s, we've lost a few of our hedgerow trees. It's not a massive decrease, but it is a decrease. But the big changes have come in these age and size categories. So before the 1998, they did it in years, and afterwards they did it in centimeters. So this is the diameter of the tree. Smaller tree diameter, younger tree generally, larger tree, older tree, in its very base form. Um, and what we've seen is that we're getting more and more older trees and less younger trees. And what that means is that um, we're getting a very aging hedgerow tree population. Now, the Forestry Commission think that we need about 45% of our trees to be under the size of 20 centimeters. We've got 20 centimeters here, and you can see that it's about 19%. So we've only got about half, less than half the amount of young hedgerow trees in our hedgerows, and that's not enough to be able to replace the old ones that are dying out. Now,
And that's what you wanted to investigate, wasn't it, Will, when you did your master's? So this is your research from your master's degree.
absolutely. So we did. So the countryside survey happens every 10 years, but the last one was 2007, and I wanted to create an up-to-date picture in a specific area. So I spend a lot of time in Shropshire, and if you go to Shropshire, you'll notice their hedgerows and hedgerow trees. You know, hedgerows are characteristic of 22 out of the 27 landscape character typologies there. Hedgerow trees are everywhere. And I wanted to recreate something which I could then relate back to the countryside survey, compare it to the national averages. So what I did is that I followed a methodology. I used the DEFRA Hedgerow Survey handbook, which I think, John, you had a hand in writing 20 or
Oh,
so years
many
ago.
of us did long time ago. It must have been, as you say, 20 plus years ago. But there were a few of us who did that. It was a good piece of work, and it's good that it's still got value even today.
And what I did is that I created a random sample, which placed a grid over Shropshire, and I randomly choose plots which were 1 kilometre square. And within these, I used a system where I randomly had 9 hedgerows for which to survey. So that was 72 hedgerows altogether. And then I went there and I surveyed those hedgerows, and I looked for um, the structure of the hedgerow, what species were in there. I looked at the hedgerow trees. I looked at what size they were, what species they were, if there was any damage to them, in order to try and mimic the countryside survey, so I could create this comparison.
And what did you find?
Um, so it was very interesting actually. So for hedgerows, we have a set of parameters um, which which we go by to work out whether or not we think a hedgerow is in a good structural condition. And it largely married up to the countryside survey. It was in Shropshire, it was in slightly better condition than the national averages, which is great. So we can see here that over half of them were in good structural condition. With when margins were included, it was 35, and with arable about 11, which all kind of married up to the countryside averages. Now, on our arable land, we tend to see decreases in the structure and the margin condition, because there's that competition for space, especially in arable systems where a lot of the land is trying to be used for crops, whereas with pasture, quite often hedgerows are easier to be integrated into those systems because they provide shade. Livestock can nibble them and get additional nutrients. There's kind of more crossover there. And the hedge trees wise, it was really interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say, what happened within the trees in that population then?
So what we saw in Shropshire is that actually the hedgerow trees were completely dominated by oak. So here we've got the countryside survey in 2007, and about 70% was with a fairly even split was oak and ash. Now, if you were looking at that data by itself, you'd think that's a big domination. That's a hedgerow tree population dominated by two species. So that's not very biosecure. Um, we need lots of different species to be able to be resilient to things like pests and diseases, but we can see that a large proportion of them is made up of oak and ash. Now in Shropshire, it was even heavily weighted towards oak, but I didn't, and there wasn't that many ash at all really. Now it what didn't seem that it was that there wasn't any ash there because they'd all died. It just seemed to be that there was more oak there. There wasn't evidence of lots of old or dead ash trees that did used to be there. Um, it just was that oak seems to have been favoured more. So this is probably a good result for ash dieback in that it might not have such a big impact in Shropshire in the hedgerow trees because there aren't as many hedgerow trees there. Um, but it might not be so good if something comes along that could affect our oak trees. So at the moment we've got something called acute oak decline, which isn't a ginormous problem at the moment, but it can reduce the kind of vitality and kill some oak trees. So we need to make sure that when we're planning our planting efforts, that we increase the number of species. But what was quite interesting is that there was a lot of holly hedgerow trees within Shropshire, and that was potentially due to there was a lot of holly hedgerows, and in folklore they used to let holly hedgerow trees grow up because they said it stopped witches being able to move around them. So there might be a little bit of like local folklore going on there.
Definitely. And
But the,
I mean, the other part is obviously you've got the species distribution, then, and then you've got the age class. And Anthony said in the chat earlier that maybe the flail has had an impact on the reduction in younger trees. So what did you find in Shropshire?
yeah, I mean, it was even more heavily weighted towards those bigger age classes. So what DBH means here is just diameter at breast height. So when we are measuring the size of the tree, the diameter, it's at 1.3 meters, and we work out how big the tree is there. So what they think is one of the reasons why we have less young hedgerow trees these days is that going back in time, the way we managed hedgerows was by hand, and we used to um, use hand tools to cut them, and then we'd lay them on a rotation. And this was all quite a slow process, and it allowed you to identify and put a marker on a hedgerow tree and let it be there, and then you'd lay it or coppice either side. Now, when the flail was invented, became very efficient to be able to kind of buzz along the top of a hedgerow, which was great for efficiency, but it was quite difficult to identify young prospective hedgerow trees. So because it was because it kind of buzzed along the top, those young trees weren't identified, and we think that might be just one of the reasons, not the sole reason, but one of the reasons why we see a reduction in young hedgerow trees. And you can see here in the countryside survey that um, less than 20% are under the 20 centimeter DBH, and about with a fairly even split 40-40 of the two bigger size categories. Now in Shropshire, it was really, really, really heavily weighted towards the biggest size category. And what this is suggesting is that these trees are getting even older again. So, and we are still seeing the same numbers of young hedgerow trees. Not a lot of young hedgerow trees at all, but absolutely loads of old hedgerow trees.
And there's been some comment in the chat about the implications of where the trees are. So Nigel said, is a tree 2 meters outside the hedge still classified as a hedgerow tree? And I think the flail is the reason that lots of people have been starting to do that, Nigel, which is they've been moving the trees away from the hedge so that they can still run the hedge management, and the hedge tree is then standing next to it. There is very good logic about that. We're still nationally looking at exactly the definitions and where that sort of rule comes into play. But as far as I'm concerned, they're definitely still hedgerow trees. And then there's been a lot of chat about elms, and we'll maybe come back to that in the end in the questioning. I think we've got a couple of minutes left, folks, before we
Yeah,
go to
absolutely.
questions. So Will's going to finish his results, because this is the most important one as far as I'm concerned, this spread of the species.
We are looking, what you can see here is that we've got some big spikes in our hedgerow trees. So on the left here, the brown and blue spike, we can see that it's dominated by oak and it's dominated by these really big age categories. And on the right here, we can see again the size of them, loads and loads of big oaks, not a lot of other species. So we've got it's completely dominated by one particular type. So we need to increase the variety of types of hedgerow trees within Shropshire and also within the country. If we think about the best hedgerow networks and hedgerow tree networks, it's all about that variety. It's all about the variety of niches which provide habitat for the biggest number of species. So if we've only got one something that dominates it, we haven't got that variety. We need more young hedgerow trees, because at the moment they're on a bit of the hedgerow trees are a bit on a bit of a knife edge, and unless we do something about it, we haven't got enough young ones to replace the old ones. So over the next few hundred years, our hedgerow tree populations might just start disappearing, and yeah, we won't be able to. We're not replacing them.
So the solution to that, I think, is that we need more knowledge in people of the importance of these hedgerow trees, more knowledge of the value of those hedgerow trees, and we need more people to think about the roles that they serve in the landscape. The thing is, as a farmer, they don't actually have a huge amount of value to you as a farmer, but they do have a huge amount of value in terms of the nation as a whole. And again, these individual trees scattered across this landscape make and define that landscape, which is part of the tourism, it's part of the cultural history, but it's balanced, as Will said, on a knife edge. And I think we probably need more study. We need more bits of research along the lines that Will's undertaken in Shropshire to start understanding better our population so that we can make better informed decisions. And Will, what do you think about the solution?
Totally, absolutely. I think my study was focused on local authority level. And I think it'd be great to see other local authorities or charities or community groups carrying out equivalent surveys so that they've got up-to-date data. And then they can begin to compare it with each other and with national averages and begin to build up an up-to-date picture of how our hedgerow trees are nationally. And it's not just knowing where they are and what state they're in. It's also building up a body of evidence that is specific to hedgerow trees. So when I was doing my research, there wasn't a huge amount of hedgerow tree specific research. There's a lot of tree specific research, but not a lot of hedgerow tree specific research. So I think we need more in that area, so we know of their impacts, we know their benefits, and that can help us understand what we need to do to help them.
And I think at that point where we might want to open up to the floor to questions, because we've only got 10 minutes left. Okay. And there are so many things that that have been flying through the questions that I think we ought to give people the space to have the chance to ask us a few questions. I know that we were going to just touch on the policy implications of this, and there are huge policy implications that we need to consider. How we're going to get these trees into the landscape. We're going to need to put more public support into farmers and farming to grow more of these hedgerow trees. And we're going to need to think better about how we do our aftercare and management. So we've got to start thinking about growing and planting more. We've got to get more of them into the landscape. We've got to get them through. We've got to start thinking about how we tag them again, which we've done previously. We've got to think about how we retain some continuity of that hedgerow population. And we do have to think about some of the management practices that are being done to ensure that the hedges are managed properly. But if we can get all of these things right, and I genuinely believe that we can get to a place where our hedgerow tree population has a strong and vibrant future. You can see from the pictures why they matter. And that means we've got to get our management right, which is our next one. And we've got to get to the point where we understand what the policy arena is. How do we manage our hedges better for the future? How do farmers get involved and make a use of some of those hedgerow trees? And what is the policy framework in the farming landscape that we need to adopt to get this fabulous population of trees thriving and growing? So let's open to a few questions. And we've got a huge range of comments and chats. There was an awful lot going on in the chat about elms, and I can see that. So let's just do a little bit about elms. Elms are Britain's probably most complicated group of trees. We've really no idea exactly how many there are, and depending upon who you listen to, there might be 2, 4, 7, or even as many as 60 different species of elm in trees. But I think it was, I can't remember if it was, I apologize if I get the name wrong because I've forgotten, but I think maybe Rachel was talking about the fact that in her hedges that the elms were surviving if they were managed as a hedgerow. If they grew into trees, then the beetles hit them. I'm sorry if I've miscredited that comment to somebody. But that is absolutely important point. If you manage your hedgerows as a hedge and your elms as hedge, you can retain the elms in it because the beetles only live in the big sized wood. They only survive in wood about this sort of size. And if the elms are less than this sort of size in circumference, then the beetles just can't get hold. So coppicing and trimming your elms in your hedges will retain them in the landscape for much longer than they will if they're allowed to grow into bigger trees, because then they are subject to the elm disease that can take them out.
We've got an interesting one from Kate here, which is 100 meters roadside hedge managed by conservation laying. What hedgerow trees should they allow to grow, and how many? So
rule of thumb for the distance is we think that bats traveling across landscapes, they really don't like gaps of more than about 20 meters. So if bats are your proxy for a healthy environment, which is, they're not a bad proxy for a healthy environment, then you would want a hedgerow tree about every 20 meters across your landscape. It turns out that species doesn't matter in terms of what they are. What we want is a diversity of species. And look around you to see what there is that is thriving out there as well. So we don't want a preponderance of, as he's got in Shropshire, of one species. But, you know, even a hawthorn let to grow as a tree, they say that one hawthorn grown up as a tree produces the flowers of 200 meters of hedge. So, you know, you can just let the hawthorn occasionally grow up and form into hedgerow trees, and that will have a huge biodiversity impact. So on average, 1 per 20 meters. I'm not particularly worried about the species, but whatever grows best locally. And anything can do, because it can all have a really important biodiversity impact.
I think it's that variety, isn't it? I think there's a trend to planting trees which are going to grow to be a huge size and age, which is great, but we do want that variety. And I think even, like you say, even just letting a hawthorn grow up, a blackthorn, hazel, rowan, whatever it is, that variety is really important. In urban forestry, kind of for the last 20, 30, 40 years, there's been the 10, 20, 30 rule, which is no more than 10% the same species, no more than 20% the same genus, 30% the same family. And although that might not work within the kind of national landscape, because you've got to think about landscape character and how the trees will sit within the landscape, it could be quite a good technique to look at to alter, to be able to say, okay, well, let's find a method to make sure that we have got this variance in our species that we're planting and keep track of it.
And let's do some quick fire ones. There's some quick fire questions that we can do quickly. Anthony says, has there been any advance in popularizing hedge cutting as tree hay? Anthony, not really. It's a nice idea. It could be really valuable, but it hasn't really spread. It's not an idea that's not without merit, but it's just not an idea that has really caught hold. Sonia says, which hedgerow tree species would be best for exposed hillside sites? Depends on which hillsides you're on, Sonia, really. But if you're up in the Welsh margins, like Will is there, then rowans and hollies are really good for that sort of thing, as is hazels. If you're in other exposed areas like coastal areas, salt, you might want to think about. I'm gonna be shot by as a heretic now. You might want to think about things like sycamore, which actually really can cope with with salt winds, but many people don't like in their hedgerows for all sorts of reasons. So it will depend entirely upon which exposed hillside site you've got, Sonia. But there are lots of different trees that you could plant into that mix. Will, there's one maybe you'd like to do. Where to plant the hedgerow tree? In the hedge or outside the hedge? If outside, how far, says Lynn?
It depends on what's going on with the hedgerow. So if you've got a very healthy hedgerow which is completely connected and is continuous all the way along, you might want to think about planting on the outside. It could be one within a meter of the hedgerow. Um, if you're going to plant it within the hedgerow, then you have to cut a notch in that hedgerow to be able to plant it. So actually planting on the outside of it could, on one hand, mean that you don't have to cut a notch and maintain that continuity, but also by planting just outside it, that hedgerow tree is probably going to be more visible. And especially if you put a tag on it, you put some a wooden stake next to it, and you protect that hedgerow tree, and it's more visible to someone coming along to cut that hedgerow with regular maintenance. Then actually putting it on the outside could be beneficial. But if you've got gaps in your hedgerow, then they are the perfect place to plant your hedgerow trees. But it's not just planting that is the way to
Yeah.
increase hedgerow tree number. You could just
Lynn
have
says it's a gappy hedge that she's trying to fill in. So I
perfect.
think fill in the gaps and therefore put them either centre line if you want, or as Will said, just slightly to the edge, just so that when you're flailing the top, you've got that capacity. And I'm
But it
afraid,
doesn't
folks,
it
we're
doesn't need
supposed to be
sorry.
up against the 2 o'clock deadline, and so I'm going to ask the last question of Will, which is from Jill, um, which was, is there a toolkit of stuff to help tree wardens and others to try and do these surveys? And do you want to just tell people about some of our ideas in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. So the PTS's Great British Hedgerow Survey is a really good hedgerow survey to be able to go out um, and go and do the surveying. It's a really good method. The way I did it was that I used the DEFRA's um, method to create a random sample, and I'm more than happy to talk to people about how I did that. I can send out my email address out afterwards if people are interested in that. We've got some hedgerow and hedgerow tree related material on the Hedge Hub on HedgeLink, which can tell you more about hedgerow trees and also tell you more about how you can go about doing hedgerow surveys as well.
And I think, unfortunately, Will, because you and I can talk hedgerows and hedgerow trees until our cows come home, literally, I think we've run out of time on our allotted slot today. So as you started, I think it's only right and proper that you should close. So do you want to close this afternoon's session?
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you all so much for coming along. If you've got any questions, do feel free to email me, and I can put my email address in the chat. Thanks for coming along and celebrating National Hedgerow Week, and we hope we see you all again soon.